Hello all, it's Ruthie. I'm going to read to you today my book, Susie Solves the Case. This was the first book I ever wrote. I wrote this when I was about 13 actually, although it went through many edits. And I even did a whole lot of pictures for it, which I've since lost. And I showed it to an adult I much admired and respected. And they said, and I quote, "Yes, but will it go anywhere?" Which was actually very mean of them, but I think it's because they had had their own rather disappointing experience with publishing. Nevertheless, the joke's on them because, as you can see, it did go somewhere, and I'm going to read it to you today. So, let us begin. In a large hollow tree in Tinkerberry Lane, there lived a mouse named Susie Buttercup who dreamed of becoming a detective. Her favourite author was called Jane Enigma, who wrote mystery stories. Years ago, Jane had disappeared, but her books continued to come out. Susie had learned a lot from these books. She had learned that it is no good having a detective kit that everyone can see because this ruins any disguise. So she convinced her mum to sew her a top secret petticoat with loads of pockets for her to hide her equipment. "This is excellent," said Susie. "Now no one will know that I am a great detective." What she really needed now was a mystery to solve, but Tinkerberry Lane was irritatingly devoid of crime. "Mum," said Susie, "can we move to a more dangerous neighbourhood, please?" "Absolutely not," said Mum. "Why would you ask such a silly thing?" "Because I want to use my marvellous detective kit," said Susie. "What about a murder mystery party for your birthday then?" suggested Dad. "We could invite the bog washers." "All right," said Susie excitedly. All the same, Susie still felt that she needed a proper mystery to solve. She knew that most crimes happen in the dark, so every night she would watch out of her window for something interesting to happen. Then one night she saw a light bobbing around in the stump where the mice housed their boats. "Aha!" squealed Susie, "a criminal!" And she slipped down the stairs and out into the night. Someone was banging around and coughing inside. "That dirty crock," thought Susie, "stealing all our boat tackle." Then she threw the door open. "Put your hands up," she shouted bravely. "I'm making a citizen's arrest." "What for?" demanded a low and growly voice. "For stealing," said Susie indignantly. A very cross-looking mouse came to the door and Susie gasped. It was Mr. Quince Blossom, the owner of the tackle shed. "I was collecting life jackets to mend," he said sternly, "and shouldn't you be in bed? I bet your parents don't know where you are." Oh dear. Mr. and Mrs. Buttercup were mortified when Mr. Quince Blossom showed up with Susie on their doorstep. "I bet you didn't know she was out making citizens' arrests at night," he chuckled. He had cooled down and he was treating the whole thing as a great joke. Susie glared at him. "We're so sorry," Mr. and Mrs. Buttercup told him. "Go to bed at once, Susie," they told her. The next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Buttercup came into Susie's bedroom. "Your obsession with crime is not nice," Mr. Buttercup told her. "Your father is quite right," agreed Mrs. Buttercup. "In view of your dreadful behaviour last night, we have decided to cancel your murder mystery birthday party." "What?" yelled Susie. "We're sorry," her parents told her, "but we think a nice little picnic on Bluebell Island would be more appropriate." Susie was furious. She went into the kitchen where Mrs. Buttercup was making lots of delicious picnic food. There was also a boring packet of gluten-free crackers. Mr. and Mrs. Buttercup had recently become health freaks. "Can't I have one more chance, Mum?" she whined. "I do so want to have a murder mystery party for my birthday." "Certainly not," snapped Mrs. Buttercup. "It was very naughty of you to arrest Mr. Quince Blossom like that. We're very lucky he's being so nice about it and rowing us over to the island tomorrow." The next morning dawned annoyingly bright and clear. However, Susie did spot a small black cloud in the sky and tried to convince her parents to cancel the picnic. But all they said was, "Don't be so silly, Susie. We can't see anything." "But it really is there," insisted Susie. "No, it is not," said Mrs. Buttercup. "You're just trying to get your horrid murder party back, and it jolly well won't work." You can either go to the picnic party, Susie, warned Mr. Buttercup, or you can stay home and weed the whole garden by yourself. Susie sulkily accompanied her parents down to the edge of the river. Michael, Penny and Henry Bogwasher and their parents were already there. Mr. Quince Blossom was there too. The newly mended life jackets lay on the bank. "Good morning," said Mr. Bogwasher. "What a lovely day for a picnic. Unfortunately, there aren't enough seats for us to all go together." "But Mr. Quince Blossom doesn't mind making 2 trips," said Mrs. Bogwasher. "We thought the children could go first." Mr. Quince Blossom winked at Susie. "So you want to be a detective?" he chuckled. Susie scowled. "Don't make that face at me," he said. "There's a mystery on the island. Many years ago there was a castle. One night a band of pirates sailed up this river to loot the treasury. But when they got inside, everyone had escaped. And still, no one knows how." "What happened to the castle?" asked Michael Bogwasher. "The pirates were so mad they smashed it all to bits," said Mr. Quince Blossom. "That big black cloud looks like a pirate ship," said Penny Bogwasher. "Ha!" said Susie. "I told Mum and Dad there was a cloud." "I wouldn't worry about it," said Mr. Quince Blossom. "The weather mouse promised a fine day. I'll be back with your parents soon." But the weather mouse was wrong, and a huge storm swept in while Mr. Quince Blossom was rowing back. It tossed his boat over, and he only just managed to swim for the bank. The Bogwashers and the Buttercups hurried Mr. Quince Blossom to Oak Cottage to dry off. Mr. Buttercup frantically called the Coast Guard. "Oh no," sobbed Mrs. Buttercup, collapsing into an armchair. "Susie told us there was a cloud and we didn't listen." "You simply don't understand," Mr. Buttercup was saying into the telephone. "Our children are on the island all alone." "Well, I'm sorry, sir," said the Coast Guard, "but the storm is just too huge. We'll have to wait until morning before we can attempt a rescue." The rain poured down on the island. "I wish they'd come and get us," whimpered Penny. Michael looked at the sky gloomily. He was a river scout and knew the most about storms. "I think we'll have to spend the night," he said. "What?" wailed Henry. "But I'm hungry." "Well, let's have something to eat then," said Susie, opening the basket. Then they sighed in disappointment. All the basket held was a big bottle of water and gluten-free crackers. "Just our luck to be stranded with that basket," groaned Susie. "You wanted a detective party, Susie," said Penny. "Why don't you come up with a way to find the castle ruins? Maybe there'll be some shelter there." "If this was a Jane Enigma mystery story," said Susie, "then we'd head uphill because castles are always built on the highest point." So they set off. "I had no idea this island was so huge," puffed Henry. "I don't think we're going to find that castle before nightfall," said Michael. "I think we'd just better make camp in this bush." They crawled inside the bush. "Ow!" cried Penny. "I've stubbed my toe on something." "An old trapdoor with an iron ring set in it," exclaimed Susie. "I bet it leads down to the old castle cellars." "Or a haunted dungeon," said Henry in a ghoulish voice. "Stop that, Henry," said Michael sternly. "I think it's very clever of Susie to find us some shelter." "It was my toe," Penny pointed out. "Then you have a clever toe," said Susie kindly. "Now, everyone follow me." They came to a locked door. "Do you hear that?" whispered Penny. "It's coming down the tunnel." "Clomp, clomp, clomp," went the sound. "But maybe it's a ghost," suggested Henry through chattering teeth. "Me? A ghost?" snorted an indignant voice. "Fiddlesticks!" A soggy-looking mouse popped out from the tunnel. "What a nasty storm," she said cheerfully. "I had to bring my pet in. I suppose you're stranded." "Yes," said Susie. "We thought we might shelter here. I think I can offer you some nicer accommodation than that," smiled the mouse. She unlocked the door. In the corner of the room was a stack of familiar books. "Do you like Jane Enigma as well?" gasped Susie. "Actually," said the mouse, "I am Jane Enigma." "Why did you suddenly disappear?" asked Susie. "Because I never solved a real mystery," said Jane sadly. After dinner, Jane pulled out some mattresses and blankets. "Time for bed," she said. "I hope we can go home tomorrow," yawned Henry. "That's true," agreed Michael, "but this has been quite the adventure." "Oh yes," they all said. "Best party ever, Susie." Susie smiled. "Thanks, guys," she said. "Has the storm cleared?" asked Michael at breakfast. "No," said Jane gloomily. "Never mind that," said Susie. "I think I've solved the mystery." They all looked at her admiringly. "Susie," said Jane, "you are a wonder." "There must be a secret tunnel somewhere," said Susie. "We're going to find it." "How?" asked Penny. "With my super detective kit," said Susie, flicking her skirt up. "Michael, you tap the walls and use the stethoscope to listen for a hollow sound. Penny, you measure the floor to see if the foundations have been carved out. And Henry, use my magnifying glass to look for large cracks in the wall." "I found it!" Susie cried. She pushed and the wall opened. The children rushed through, but Jane lingered back. "Aren't you coming?" called Susie. "I'm scared," Jane gasped. "What if I'm too old to have an adventure?" "You're never too old for that," said Susie. "I suppose you're right," giggled Jane. Suddenly, Susie's torch flashed on something shiny. "Is that a train?" she yelled. "Amazing," said Michael. "And how we'll get back home," said Susie. "It probably doesn't even work anymore," said Jane. Michael looked inside. "It's in perfect running order," he said. "Come on then," said Susie. "Everyone on board." "Start it up, Susie," said Michael. The train gave a rusty cough and began to crawl out of the station. Then it went faster. "Everyone hold on tight," shouted Susie. The train rushed through the darkness. Then, just as they thought they couldn't hold on any longer, it smoothed out and clicked along at a nice steady pace. Suddenly, the train stopped. Through the gloom, they could see another staircase. "All out for whatever station this may be," cried Susie. They raced up the stairs and pushed against the door. "It won't budge," said Henry. "Push harder," said Susie. "Creak," said the door. "Ooh," groaned the mice. Pop went the door. They staggered out into the sunlight. The storm had gone while they were underground. "I can't wait to get home," said Susie, leading the way to Oak Cottage. At Oak Cottage, the bog washer and Buttercup parents were pulling on their gumboots. "We simply must get over to that island," they said. Then they rushed through the woods towards the riverbank. Mrs. Buttercup jumped. "Susie," she gasped. "We solved the island's riddle and escaped," Susie told her. "This is Jane Enigma." "I'm so grateful you looked after them," said Mrs. Buttercup. Susie was the one taking care of things. "She's a real little detective," Jane told her. "Really?" said Mrs. Buttercup proudly. "Mum, can everyone come to our house for birthday cake?" asked Susie. "Good idea," said Mrs. Buttercup. As they walked home, they met Mr. Quince Blossom. "How did you get back?" he asked. "It's quite the story," said Mrs. Buttercup. "Come back and hear all about it." Mr. Quince Blossom looked at Jane Enigma and turned red. "I'd love to," he said. "This has been the best birthday party ever," said Susie as they waved goodbye to everyone. "Well, I have to admit your detective work really paid off," said Mr. Buttercup. "And I think Mr. Quince Blossom is going to be grateful to you for the rest of his life," smiled Mrs. Buttercup, looking at Jane Enigma and Mr. Quince Blossom chatting in the lane. "I suppose we could still run your murder mystery party after all," said Mr. Buttercup. "Are you kidding?" laughed Susie. "After my picnic party on Bluebell Island? That would seem really boring." The end. Thank you for listening. If you want the book, you can get it on Amazon, wherever good books are sold, and also our family website, zealouspublishing.com. Bye-bye.